DH is a hotbed for nerds, but not all the tech that bubbles up on race bikes makes it through the furnace of racing and into the mainstream. But are tune mass dampers the next must-have upgrade? Downhill teams this year started to experiment with some unusual looking devices on their bikes. Mondraker and Trek were some of the first to lead the charge using these devices. They're a sort of strange looking cylinder up near the sort of head tube of the bike, or some down by the bottom bracket and others towards the rear swing arm. The race scene has been a real buzz about these new devices. We're going to try and sort the fact from fiction and tell you all you need to know about tune mass dampers. Could you say that DH is the Formula One of mountain biking? I think you probably could. Both have had a similar charge forward, yet downhill is untethered by the rules that control Formula One. But even without these controls, downhill has sort of slowed in terms of the tech that's coming up. So wheel size have settled, we've had a bit of a debate. Geometry has settled down as well, so gone are the wild variations. Of course, suspension is improving, but we're not seeing the light speed, the huge leaps forward. It's very, very incremental change. Of course, racers and teams are always looking for gains, but now they're having to use, well, marginal gains. It's a thing that first popped up in road racing, actually, and that's where if you look at lots of small little incremental changes that if your other teams and other competitors aren't doing, well, it can mean big changes on times in between the tapes. Many teams this year have begun looking into the tech that's been banned by other sports, or just been banned in general. So now we've got skin suits again, or I should say speed suits. And we've got electronic suspension from RockShox, from Öhlins, from Fox, and we've got these mysterious cylinders. We now know that these mysterious cylinders are tuned mass dampers. Okay, damper. It's an interchangeable term that covers lots of things, and some of them will be new to you as mountain bikers, but others won't be. So, shock absorber, or a damper, or a shock. That's what we're describing here. And the official words are a device that can help absorb or offset impacts. So it kind of makes sense, and that's what we're talking about with these dampers. So in mountain bike, we're often using air or a metal spring, and we're using hydraulic damping, whether that be in a rear shock or a front fork, and that's what we're talking about. We're talking about something that can absorb a bump and return the wheels effectively back to that preloaded position. So we're floating along. That's what dampers mean. Before we get too nerdy, I just want to say, if you like this and you like other videos on our channel, well, if you're not a subscriber, please do subscribe and hit the thumbs up and like this video. So, what's a tune mass damper? Okay, we're going to describe how it works literally first, because that's almost easier than working out, well, the science behind what it's doing when it works. So, as the name suggests, we've got a mass, which is literally a weight, and, well, the tuned bit, and the damped bit, that means we've got some springs, so that that mass can move, well, independently of the rest of whatever it's bolted to. The weight matters. Why? Well, it'll affect how the tune mass damper works and works with all the other parts of the system, because we've got to think systematically about this damper working as part of a unit. So the mass will be really important, because the way it moves and when it moves will affect the frequency of bumps that it can help manage. So again, they might look complex, but in mechanical terms, they are pretty simple. Now, how they affect the bike, it does get more complicated. Let's get nerdy. Tune mass dampers come in many shapes and sizes, and they come really big and really small. And when I say big, I mean big, like Taiwan's Taipei 101 Tower, a huge skyscraper. So, it's got a tune mass damper that is 660 metric tons, and it's between the 92nd and 87th floor, and it's suspended on 92 steel cables, and it's got a row of dampers all the way around it. And it moves a bit like a pendulum, so if the building is affected by typhoons or earthquakes or any movement, well, because there's this large mass and it's got so much inertia, it moves at a different rate to the rest of the building. It moves out of phase. And that's important. These dampers, this is the tune part, try and help it manage the range of motion. But this mass trying to get back into phase with the building itself means that it balances out the loads. It is the tune mass damper. There's small-scale ones, or smaller anyway, and we'll go back to the Formula One example, because Formula One used to use tune mass dampers. The Renault R26 in sort of 2005 to 2006 used tune mass dampers, and the weight of their dampers were between 9 and 10 kgs, and they used them across the car. They used them on the suspension and on the engine itself. It was really quick as well. It gave a really big advantage to balance out these frequencies. It was such an advantage. It gave 0.3 of a second on many, many tracks. In fact, it was so quick that the FIA, the governing body of Formula One, decided to ban it. Now we're going to get a little bit more complex, and we're going to talk about phasing, and we're going to talk about phasing in and out, because this is an important thing that these tune mass dampers can do. A good analogy would be to think about sound and think about headphones. Sound is effectively an oscillating curve, so we've got peaks and troughs, and that's what makes the noise that you can hear. Now, how these headphones work is by listening to the sounds that's happening and creating one that matches the same curve profile, so that's the oscillation and amplitude, but effectively makes a mirror to this signal, this curvy line. And basically by matching both of those curvy lines means that, well, they blank each other out. The energy is just equaled. So with sound cancelling headphones, it's a really easy analogy, and we can imagine how if there's a noise that's repeating, your headphones will be able to create a little noise that cancels it out. So how does sound cancelling headphones or any of this wave stuff attach to your bike? Okay, well, think of a side view of your bike and it's going across undulating terrain, it's going after rough bumps, and think about your front axle and how it's moving across the terrain. Yes, your suspension is going to absorb some of it, so that wave shape that's happening and feeding into the bike and all of your components on the bike, those bumps, those impacts, the frequency of those hits feed in. The suspension system will be able to manage some of them, but not all of them. Is that a reason why those electronic suspension systems have been really popular with DH racers? Maybe. It means that there's more changes that they can do on the fly, so that they've got a wider range of bumps that they can work with. But even with those systems, there's certain frequencies of bumps, certain impacts, whether it be the speed or the size of them, that are still going to feed back all the way through that system. So effectively, your suspension can do so much, but you're still going to feel some of the forces through your hands, through your feet. And that's where playing with that wave curve might help us. Another way of explaining these forces that are coming into the bike is talking about frequency. But what's frequency? This is the number of occurrences of a repeating event per unit of time, most often measured as hertz. The different frequency of the forces also matters. So have a think about if you're bombing on a downhill and you go across just small chattery stuff. It still impacts the bike, and it will impact the bike differently to, well, slow speed, really big hits. The frequencies do matter and make a difference to how the bike handles. We've already discussed that the suspension is going to handle some of these impacts, some of these frequencies, some of these forces to you. But there's lots of other factors on the bike that can also affect the stiffness and the absorption as well. So I guess tyres, like the carcass and the air pressure, those are going to affect how those bumps migrate through the system. And the wheel as well, depending on what the rim structure is like, how stiff it is, how the spoke tension is. They're all going to affect into the system. There's lots of other factors too, so the frame itself, depending on the construction, maybe the material, how that absorbs the bumps, how stiff it is going to absorb different frequencies of bumps. So we've got frame, we've got wheels. Where else can these bumps migrate to? Well, the handlebar, to the grips, even to the pedals and even to your shoes. They're all part of this overall system where we need to try and eliminate certain frequencies that the suspension just can't handle. Back to those marginal gains. Yeah, top pro riders have their bikes completely dialed. The suspension is perfect, pretty much everything about their bike is perfect, so they're looking for that next step. And that's where these tune mass dampers come in, because it's an extra level of damping and adjustment that can change how the bike feels. So how does it work? Well, if we think back to the Type A Tower, or we think about those sound cancelling headphones, the mass is moving out of phase from the rest of the bike. And that movement means that it affects the frequency, and it can chop the top off some of the really high and peaky loads. So it's not going to cancel them out like headphones, but it's going to get close by counteracting. For many riders, the force and frequency that's counteracted is the one that causes fatigue in hands and in feet. So if racers are finding that their stiffer setup gives them lots of hand pump or even feet pump, well, maybe that's where the tune mass damper can help. One of the teams that was leading the charge this year using tune mass dampers was Trek Factory Racing, and we chatted to PA mechanic to Loris Vergier, the current world champion, all about them. So can you talk about the origins of how you started tune mass dampers? It seems like, you know, this year was the year of tune mass dampers. They popped up on lots of bikes.
Crazy this year, like the Mondraker boys had it, and Amore Pierron has got one, and yeah, and all the Trek Factory Racing, we all have one. So yeah, for us, it all started December 2023. when on a test camp that our team manager Ryan Gold brought some the first countershock to try it, and so Loris really testing minded, really want to try things and go testing and back to back. So we straight away tried it, removed it and back again. And on the third run, he said, yes, that's it. I want to leave it on. It's just good. It's just great, smooth and efficient ride. He loved it.
So from just third run out, he decided that it worked and he preferred those kind of like the benefits of it. So did the countershock, this tune mass damper, have effects on also how you set the bike up as well in terms of suspension balance?
So this is a great question. A few people asked me this. Basically, the first few runs we tried, we didn't change anything suspension just to see back to back how it feels. And then after we add some weights and everything. So we did some clicks here and there, but literally you don't need to change anything. You just put them on. So we had only one. So we tried it on the front because we had only one. And then by the first race of the season, like for William or maybe the second race, then we managed to get two. So we straight away, Loris really likes a balanced bike. On the front, just reduce arm pump, reduce hardness of chop on the front end. And on the rear, basically, just going to reduce as well as the harshness.
So I guess in the future, tune mass dampers are here to stay for the racers?
That's a good question. Like in the future, you never know. You will always get surprised every year. It's just surprise after surprise. Oh, what about this? What about that? And yeah, but mass damper, it's so good so far. Like I think it's gonna stay for a little bit. Like the O chain, like everyone has got it's going crazy. Even if people say, "Oh, the high pivot bike, why do you have O chain? It doesn't make any sense." Blah, 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 blah. Well, just try it. Just try it. It's the same thing with the counterstroke. So just try it.
Where should you run these tune mass dampers? Well, before we get into the details of where you could run them, we're just going to touch on that old topic of sprung mass versus unsprung mass. So, sprung mass is all of that is above the suspension, and unsprung mass is all of that that's below the suspension. So think of it in terms of your tyres, wheels, maybe a swing arm, the fork lowers, that is all unsprung. Now, the sprung bit is mostly your mainframe, bars and stems. And why this matters is the ratio between these two masses means how effective your suspension will be. Ideally, we want that sprung mass to be quite a lot heavier, and with bike frames, that's quite a challenge. So, back to where we should run these tune mass dampers. Essentially, as the damper is going to work independently of the suspension system and is just working on certain frequency, it shouldn't really matter. However, Loris, who is a world champion, ran his on the sprung mass, so one up by his fork, just below his stem, and one by his bottom bracket. So if it works for him, it's probably a good idea. Should we all run tune mass dampers? Maybe. I think it depends on where you're riding and how you're riding and the setup of your bike. I think it's a bit like if we look at these racers, they're looking for marginal gain. So they're changing tyres all the time, and they're changing the knob pattern, they're changing the carcass, they're changing what PSI they run. They might run different wheels with different spoke tension. They're definitely on first name terms with their suspension tuner. And there's all those things that they're doing right, and they're doing already. So I guess if you're a rider and you haven't done those, first step would be to look at all of those things and make sure that your bike is as set up as it can be before you look at this extra step. I think suspension setup is also a factor. If you're like a racer and you're running a really stiff setup, then potentially you're going to feel more benefits of the system because it's going to affect more of those sort of harsh frequency bumps that can lead to arm pump and feedback through the feet. If you're running a kind of initially softer, more progressive setup though, well, maybe you're not going to get as much advantage because the suspension can do more of that work. But I think it's really proven on the World Cup, and lots of races do have different setups, so it should work across all of them. Do they work? I think, yeah, they do. In the lab, yes, they definitely work. There's science there. There's lots of applications where it works in other industries, be it high towers, Formula One cars. It's there. It does work. Does it apply to the trail? I think for me, it can do. But again, it's that marginal gains thing. So if you're not doing all the other bits, it's not for everybody. But what are your thoughts? Dive into the comments, let us know your thoughts on tune mass dampers and if you're going to rush out and buy one. Which one? When you're going to get it? Which bike you're going to fit it to? Let us know in the comments down below.